discussion on democratic resilience and nuclear deterrence. At Carnegie Europe, we're really keen to promote difficult conversations in the European public sphere because we think that they're necessary. These are very difficult times. Here at Carnegie, we've done a lot of work on democracy, democratic resilience, but obviously, since Russia's nuclear saber rattling in Ukraine and the United States national security strategy, nuclear deterrence has also come back to the fore of discussions and bringing back some ideas that date back to the 70s and 80s. And I think at a time in which Europeans are being asked to spend more on defense, in some cases at the expense of other policy areas, it's really important to understand what the escalation ladder looks like and how to move between democratic resilience and nuclear deterrence. And this, of course, happens on a backdrop of very brittle international politics and of very complicated global landscape as far as international agreements are concerned on arms control, nuclear control, and of course, add to that a whole set of new threats and challenges such as artificial intelligence, biological weapons, etc. So we think it's time to have a conversation about this. And the opportunity is provided by the publication of a paper, Nuclear Deterrence to Democratic Resilience, towards a 21st century security paradigm, which is authored by Mary Kaldor, who's joined me here today, Rosa and Sam Vincent, who are here in the audience, as part of the LSE's Conflict and Civicness Research Group. So we're going to hold this debate. We have a great panel of highly expert speakers. I'll start with Mary Kaldor, who is Professor Emeritus at the London School of Economics and the Director of the Conflicts and Civil Society Research Unit there. We're going to continue with Annukka Ylivaara, who is the Assistant Secretary General at the Security Committee, Finnish Ministry of Defense. And then, last but not least, Boris Ruge, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy at NATO. This conversation is live streamed, so we will be taking questions from the audience in person and online. So get your thinking caps on if you want to ask questions. But we're going to start first with the first round. Mary, if you could say in a few minutes, give us the main headlines of your report, and then we'll move on to commenting your paper, and then opening the conversation up to further questions. So Mary, please, the floor is yours.
Well, first, just thank you, Rosa, and thank you to Carnegie Europe for organizing this event. It's great, and it's wonderful to see so many people here in the audience. We're at such an important moment. Every day something terrible happens. And I think after the whole discussion about green, we really are beginning to realize we need more European autonomy. But what does European autonomy mean? And that's the big question. And what we want to argue is it shouldn't be just reproducing NATO or reproducing NATO posture on a European basis. It's an opportunity to rethink how we do security. The whole discussion has tended to focus on increases in defense, as though defense were a kind of box. But actually, I think it should be about how do we do defense differently and more safely, in fact. And we don't know whether that will cost more or less. I suspect it will cost more, but I feel we've put the cart before the horse. We haven't actually discussed what it is that we're going to do with that money, what it is, why we need that money, what a new security policy would look like. And that, I guess, is what our paper is about. And we don't know that much about NATO's current defense posture because it's classified. And so the first thing to say is we need to debate. But let me say what we think it's, well, we do know that it's very dependent on nuclear weapons, and we do know that it's associated with an idea of maneuver theory, or what the Americans call multi-domain operations. And we're suggesting as an alternative two things. One is a stronger emphasis on conventional defense, particularly the front lines, and the other is democratic resilience. And then I'll come to the end, at the end, to why I think you can't have it all. Why I think you can't have, our strategy is incompatible with a continued reliance on nuclear deterrence. So conventional defense, I always write everything down and then I don't look at my notes. I think our argument is basically, in the 1980s, there was a big debate about what now is called deterrence by punishment or deterrence by denial. An argument that the problem with deterrence was that you threatened to do something terrible, so it's inherently provocative. But supposing you could defend yourself without appearing to provoke, then that's what's meant by deterrence by denial. And I think what the Ukraine war has shown is that there is an advantage to the defense, that particularly new technologies can increase defense. So part of what we're saying is, both drones, AI, strengthen this argument, as well as the political argument about not being provocative. In other words, technologies have become so accurate and lethal, all military technologies, that actually wars do tend to attrition rather than maneuver. And so, in fact, making it clear that you can effectively defend yourself and that you can have a more dispersed defense, so you're less of a target, is a better way of doing deterrence than through threatening a terrible punishment. So that's the first part of the argument, and for time reasons I won't spell it out further. But the second part of the argument is about democratic resilience, and I think this is really, really important, because while there is a conventional threat, I think, to the frontline states, the real threat that most of us face in Europe is a political threat. We talk about hybrid threats, disinformation, sabotage, like Novichoks, that are coming mainly from Russia, but also all authoritarian states, also now from the United States. But the key problem is that they are strengthening the far right. They are playing on and deepening polarization in our society. They're contributing to the loss of trust in our institutions. So that's why democratic resilience is so important. And what does one mean by democratic resilience? Well, NATO and all our national institutions all emphasize resilience, but they usually see it in a rather technical sense as civilian preparedness, emergency services, infrastructure. But what we mean is a real effort to overcome polarization, to give people a greater sense of empowerment, which involves strengthening democracy. And that this really has to be understood as part of security. We're never going to be safe unless people have trust in their institutions. So that's basically what we're putting forward in this paper. And the final point I really want to make is, why not have nuclear weapons as well? And I think there are lots of arguments why Europe, now if we can no longer depend on US nuclear weapons, if we ever did, I think it was a psychological dependence. As Kissinger and others said, why on earth would the United States risk the world for the sake of Europe? it never was credible, but let's assume that people psychologically thought it was credible. I think it would be a real mistake to try to find a European substitute for that. And that's what we should be very clear about. And what are the reasons? Well, I can give you lots of reasons. One is basically the inherently provocative nature of nuclear weapons. It keeps the idea of war alive. I said earlier that I think that's the problem with provocation. You know, of course, I don't believe that the war in Ukraine had anything to do with NATO expansion, but it provided such a good pretext. And that pretext has been really important politically all over. So we don't want to provide that kind of pretext. So the first is it's provocative, it keeps alive an idea of war. The second is that it makes a case for having nuclear weapons. Why shouldn't everybody have nuclear weapons if they're supposed to prevent war? And the more people have nuclear weapons, the more likely accidents are to happen. And the world has become perilously close to terrible things happening as a consequence of accidents. The third thing is lack of credibility. Europe's legitimacy depends on being democratic and believing in international law. And the idea that any European leader would actually be willing to kill hundreds of thousands of people at one go, it's not credible, actually. So why, if we don't believe it, why should any adversary believe it? I think that's a very important argument, has to do with credibility. And then the final argument is a cost one. There are real trade-offs. You know, in the UK, nuclear weapons account for 40% of our procurement budget. Nobody in the military likes nuclear weapons, or practically nobody in the UK, because it really has hollowed out the army, hollowed out the navy. It just costs too much. And one thing actually I forgot to mention when I talked about resilience is that I think resilience is also a global phenomenon. I'm very concerned about aid cuts because I think our security also depends on dealing with, on helping to address conflicts in other parts of the world and the risks that those conflicts will spill over, the risks of transnational crime, the risks of migration, all of those things. And I think it's a really big mistake to go for aid cuts. So these are all the arguments. And a final argument is that we don't actually know whether deterrence works or not. People say it's kept the peace, but do we know whether deterrence kept the peace or whether there was a general taboo against the use of nuclear weapons? The only way we would ever know is if deterrence failed. So we don't actually know that. And actually a much more important way of preventing nuclear war is to strengthen that taboo, which is part of strengthening international law. So I think I've said everything I wanted to say in a very quick way, even though it's already 7 o'clock. But I just wanted to say one last thing, which is to return to what I said at the beginning. I just think it's so, I'm very glad so many people are here, because for me it's been quite shocking the way all these decisions have been taken without any public debate. And I think it's so important that we have a public debate. So it's great that everybody's here, and maybe this is the beginning of a public debate.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'd like to bring in Annukka. I'm delighted that you're here. Finland is a country that has really been cultivating the idea of comprehensive security, societal security for a couple of decades, I would say. Number two, Finland is on the front line. And you also have a past in the military. So I'd like to hear from you what your thoughts are on Mary's paper, and if you have any other ideas.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Mary, for briefing your paper. It includes a lot of interesting points. Rosa, you are right that we are in a challenging geographical situation, but that's where we have always been. So it is something that is in our DNA, so to say. And when we speak about our approach to security, in our terms, it's a concept of comprehensive security. In European terms, it's a whole of society approach. And actually, it is older than just a couple of decades because, Finland is a quite large country in European context, but sparsely populated. So we have always used to cooperate because we have to cooperate. But a real push happened after the Second World War because we were left in a very challenging situation, located next to superpower, more or less in a standalone mode. And we started to prepare for the next devastating war. So basically the threat was war. But by the end of last century, our threat spectrum broadened, including also different kind of threats. And after the collapse of Cold War, we became part of European Union, integrated politically and economically to Europe. And in 2003, we created our first security strategy for society. Actually, it was named then Strategy for Safeguarding the Vital Functions of Society. So already over 20 years ago, we described or defined those vital functions that are in the essence of our concept. The other thing that is important in our concept is the collaboration. Concept of comprehensive security is a concept of collaboration. It means that the security is not only business for authorities, it's business for the whole society. So comprehensive security means that the vital functions of society are safeguarded together with authorities, business community, organizations, which means civil society, and also individuals. And those vital functions, they are broadly described, including 7 elements: psychological resilience, leadership, international EU activities, defense capability, internal security, economy, infrastructure, and security of supply, and functional capacity of the population and services. So really a wide concept. These vital functions are needed for a functioning society. They need to be kept running on daily basis in times of disruptions and crisis. And how they are secured? They are secured together, but we have defined 56 strategic tasks to all ministries. So ministries are responsible for fulfilling these strategic tasks. Just to give a few examples, so strategic task is defending Finland in the context of alliance, but also communications or securing the energy supply. So really different kind of strategic tasks, which are all based on our existing legislation, but complemented with voluntary activities and agreements with the business community and so on. And finally, who are taking part in this security business? As said, the whole society, but there are a couple of changes or updates we made when we renewed the concept. So that the last security strategy was approved as a government resolution in the beginning of last year. And one of the biggest changes was that we emphasized the importance of individuals as a security actor. One could argue that does it mean that the authorities have less to do? No, it doesn't. But in this context nowadays, when the changes are rapid, when it's hard to predict what happens, it needs that the individuals participate even more, and they need to build their own resilience, and not only resilience on their own, but in the society overall, in their own context, in wherever they act, because it's all based on trust in the society, so that you trust the authorities, but you also trust the other fellow citizens in the society. So I think this sums it in a nutshell. What is the Finnish approach in this context, very complicated security environment that we all are facing nowadays?
Thank you very much. I have some questions for you, but I want to turn first to Boris, just to look at this question from the NATO perspective. There's been, many more security-related issues have fallen on NATO's agenda. So, well, I'll let you elaborate on what NATO is doing and what NATO is thinking about it, bearing in mind that a lot of the conversations are still classified. So,
no, let me start by thanking you for having us here on stage and to have this conversation. I'll begin by agreeing with a number of points in Mary's paper. So number one, I think building resilience is important. And it's not just in a technical sense. Annukka just described some of that, but of course it is social cohesion as well that comes into the picture. Reflecting on our deterrence and defense is important, and just debating that publicly is important. The paper, I think, rightly acknowledges the need for greater investments in conventional defense. I think it's worth having a discussion about getting the mix right, learning the lessons from the war in Ukraine. In that context, I would say that, of course, we are in the business of deterrence by denial, which is why we have all sorts of multinational NATO forces right on the eastern flank, including, for the first time in the history of the Federal Republic, a permanent deployment of in this case, a full brigade in Lithuania, right? And that is because, as we say, we want to defend every inch of Allied territory. We don't want anyone to invade and then punish them. We want to sort of deter them from invading and, if need be, defend at the eastern edge of the alliance. Thinking about nuclear deterrence is important, and talking about nuclear deterrence is important, and I think there's a lot of interest in that. Quite a few people in this room will have seen House of Dynamite. Some people may have read Annie Jacobson's book that came out last year, which describes a scenario. Very, very important, because nuclear weapons are scary things, but they are part of our world. I'll get to that in a second. And I think more broadly, the public debate is important, and it's connected to this issue of resilience. We have to have a shared understanding, to the extent possible, of how we want to defend our democracies. That's what NATO's about. Now, where I'm slightly in the disagreement category is that there's this notion of a knee-jerk reaction and sort of us going back to Cold War thinking. To that, I would say, and I say this also as a citizen of Germany and a German diplomat that I once was, let's take 2014 as the starting point, the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Of course, we could go farther back. We could go back to 2008, and we could go back to the presence of Russian troops in Moldova illegally against the wishes of the government of Moldova. But let's just take 2014 as the baseline. Invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, Russia supporting irregulars in eastern Ukraine, and then putting in troops. If you remember, they were there on vacation, is what Putin told Angela Merkel, that kind of stuff. So that's when it starts. 2014, we have a NATO summit in Wales. We say we should move to 2% of GDP for defense within a 10-year period. And then what do we observe in the case of Germany, just to take this as an example? A very, very slow reaction. I mean, hardly knee-jerk. So it's not so much the knee-jerk, I would say, it's the time lag. If we can put it differently, and we could say this: it took 2 invasions of Ukraine by Russia, and it took 2 elections of Donald Trump as President of the United States for many European nations to acknowledge that they had to step up in terms of their defense, right? Because we knew at NATO that 2% defense spending would not be enough to resource our plans for conventional defense, which are actually challenging, and part of why they're challenging is that we want to defend every inch of Allied territory, which is more difficult than defending somewhere else, right? Something we are familiar with from the Cold War, where West Germany was to be defended, right, if you like, the inner German boundary. So I think it's more the time lag than the knee-jerk that is the problem. And the time lag has led us into a position of European weakness in military terms, for which we are now paying a price. We're playing catch-up, and we are highly dependent on the United States. The United States is there. We believe the United States will be there for NATO, but the imbalance we have inside NATO is a problem and is something that needs to be fixed ASAP. Now, the other point, of course, is that what we are doing in the face of the largest land war in Europe since 1945, which has already cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and which includes indiscriminate Russian attacks, including target attacks on civilians every day. So this is the world that we inhabit. The world that we inhabit is also Russia, from President Putin down, constantly engaging in irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and coercive nuclear signaling, all the time. And then we have sort of special occasions, for example, when Russia uses intermediate range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, without warheads, targeting civilian targets in Ukraine. Pretty uncomfortable, but obviously a message that Mr. Putin wants to send not just to Ukraine, but to the rest of Europe. So I think that's important. I don't think, and this relates also to what we heard from our Finnish colleague, I think resilience is important, and I'm happy to sort of discuss democratic resilience and what that could be, but resilience is not enough. I think the paper sort of takes the case of 2014 in Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine and says Russia failed to achieve its objectives there, or the separatists failed to achieve their objectives at that point in time, which is true, and that was a result of democratic resilience. There's a lot of truth in that. And Ukraine, of course, is a prime example of democratic resilience. Yeah, we're close to the 4-year mark of this massive war. That's a model that we can all study. But just a few months before Russia failed in eastern Ukraine, it succeeded in Crimea, because in Crimea it didn't work through sort of irregulars. It sent its special forces to Crimea, and there's no democratic resilience that would have gotten in the way of that. And then when you have a referendum at gunpoint, you come out with the right result. And in 2022, with the full-scale invasion, Russia got pretty close, I think we must acknowledge that, of capturing Ukraine in an attempt to decapitate Ukraine. And if they had succeeded in that, the situation would have unfolded in a very different way. So democratic resilience, or resilience, is crucial, but it is not enough. You need your conventional defense in order. And in the face of actors like Russia, and in the face of actors like North Korea, I think you're well advised to maintain your nuclear deterrent. And I'll just end by quoting something that Emmanuel Macron said in a 2020 speech. As president of France, he is charged to give a speech on a basic kind of message on nuclear deterrence, which he did in 2020 for the first time. And I quote, he said, "I cannot set France the moral objective of disarming our democracies, while other powers or even dictatorships would be maintaining or developing their nuclear weapons. For a nuclear weapon state like France, unilateral nuclear disarmament would be akin to exposing ourselves as well as our partners to violence and blackmail, or depending on others to keep us safe." And I think there's a lot of truth in that statement.
Thank you very much, Boris. I think I'd like to go back to Annukka, if that's okay. You ended with Macron, and I'm thinking of Macron earlier in 2025, and the meeting between France and the UK, and the beginning of the talks to extend the nuclear umbrella to other European countries. And so I was just wondering, and fully aware that you can speak on behalf of Finland, but maybe if you could say something about, how does Finland view that? Are these conversations about the French and British nuclear umbrella seen as helpful? How does this fit in with the the comprehensive security concept that you talked about. And then maybe I'd ask Boris to elaborate a little bit on the efforts that NATO is doing to bring together these national debates on deterrence, on nuclear, etc. And then Mary, I'm going to turn to you maybe with a slightly different question, if that's okay, although obviously you can comment as well. So Annukka, can we start with you perhaps?
I don't think that I'm an expert on commenting on this nuclear issue. Just to a few comments is that I think that overall it is really important that we discuss about this element, because I think that a couple of decades there has been non-discussion. So it's in a way it's re-emerging, and at the same time I think that there isn't so much expertise nowadays because we haven't been focusing on this issue. But I would like to comment on Boris concerning the resilience, because I think that there is a difference how we see the resilience. In the Finnish context, the conventional defense or the defense capability overall, it's an essential element in our resilience. So, and if we talk about concepts overall, for example, how we see it is that comprehensive security is a whole of society concept, where the defense capability is an essential element. When we talk about total defense, it is part of the comprehensive security when all the civilian activities and military activities are integrated to defend the country. So both of these concepts or elements have to be in place at the same time, depending on what kind of threat you are facing. But I think that there are differences in countries how they understand these concepts.
Thank you. And Boris, I'd like to come back to you and maybe adding to, you know, what is NATO doing, but maybe if you could also look at the spectrum of deterrence, because it's not just nuclear, it's also hybrid, it's also cyber, and there's been, you know, activities have been stepped up significantly, also NATO-EU cooperation on these matters, so maybe you could say a few words about that, but also this question of the nuclear umbrella and, you know, to what extent do these national discussions or bilateral discussions, do they sink through? Or is this something that is, you know, present on the agenda?
So let me just say that of course, Finland and to some extent Sweden were out there a bit on their own because they were not part of NATO until very recently. And so there's a seriousness in those two countries when it comes to thinking about deterrence and defense and resilience that is very remarkable, and I think that can teach us a lot. When I was vice chair at Munich Security Conference a few years ago, I organized a small event with Finnish and Swedish colleagues because I thought Germans could learn a lot from this. And one of the sort of points that we asked our Swedish colleagues to brief on was a brochure that was published in 2019, which in English is something like "If War or Crisis Comes." And this brochure was sent in hard copy to every household in Sweden, so 5 million plus households, describing that war, even crisis, conflict, war can happen, and that the government will do its part, but society and individuals will have to do their part as well. Right? And so part of this is practical, right? What you should have in your basement and how you should prepare. But part of it, I think, is creating a mindset that reflects the reality in which we live. Now, again, as a German, I would say, if a German government tried to sort of send out this kind of brochure, you can imagine the shitstorm that would occur, right? And the heart attacks that would follow. Because Germans don't like to hear this. But they should hear this, because not so many 100 kilometers away from the eastern border of Germany, right, separated by Poland, which is in between, we have the largest land war in Europe going on. And the view, I think, of most allies at NATO is that President Putin's appetite may not be satisfied if he can sort of absorb Ukraine or dominate Ukraine. So I think it's important to be serious about these things and to have a public awareness, a shared understanding of the threats that are out there. But Finland, of course, as I think your former president Niinistö said, you have the best artillery in Europe, right? So you're very serious about conventional defense. And by the way, you were a nation that acquired the F-35 early on because you think that F-35s are important. So it's really a whole spectrum of things. And now, by the way, you're bringing back landmines because you're faced with this very uncomfortable neighbor, and you have a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia, and you have come to the view on a national basis that you want to leave the Ottawa Convention because you want to protect yourself against that neighbor. Very uncomfortable stuff, but serious. There's serious thinking here. Now, on the messaging from NATO, you know, the debate, the main debate has to be at the national level. So NATO, of course, is absolutely crucial for the deterrence and defense of all allies, especially European allies. But that is a debate. First and foremost, the unit in which this debate has to take place is the national unit. Of course, my boss, Mark Rutte, sort of contributes to this debate as well, and some of you may have seen the speech that he gave or heard the speech that he gave in Berlin back in December, around about a month ago, where he set out in very stark terms the reality that we might be facing, which is the reality of large-scale conflict in Europe. And that is something that we do not want to see happen, and because we do not want to see it happen, we need to be prepared to resist coercion and preserve the peace. And if need be, we need to be able to fight. So I think that was a very stark message. I think there were different reactions to that, but I think it did generate debate, and debate is exactly what we need. On the hybrid, just as a final point, that's of course a big preoccupation of ours. And it is by definition complicated because it is so many things. It's disinformation, it's sabotage, right? It's cyber attacks and so on. And of course, in some cases we're learning. This is a sustained Russian campaign that has been playing out for several years at this point in time. Sometimes the Secretary General objects to the term hybrid. He thinks it's too harmless. But we have not really come up with a good substitute to describe this. The Secretary General and some European leaders have said we are not in a state of war, but we are not at peace either. I think that's an accurate description. So, you know, if we're talking about sabotage, in some cases, sabotage that risks mass casualties. Think of the DHL packages. Think of the sort of attacks on the Polish railway. You know, that could easily create a mass casualty event. It is targeted executions. We can go back many years to things that happened in the UK, Skripal using chemical weapons, Litvinenko also attacks on Russian deserters or Ukrainians who were in rehabilitation in Europe. You know, that's pretty serious stuff. And then you have cyber attacks, then you have disinformation. So, you know, there's a lot going on there, and we sometimes struggle with getting a handle on it. I would, however, say we have to look at the rationale. Why is Russia doing this? And I think a key reason why Russia is doing this is to undermine support for Ukraine. And have they succeeded in that regard? And the answer is a resounding no, right? So support to Ukraine in our societies remains strong, and support, financial and military, for Ukraine continues. And in that sense, the Russian hybrid campaign has failed on what is perhaps its single most important objective. And therefore, I would say we have been able to handle it despite, you know, struggling here and there.
Thank you. We still have, I'd like to, Mary, I've let the others speak, so I'd like to give you a few minutes before we open this up for discussion. And aside from, you know, feel free to pick on any topic or issue that has been raised, but I'd also like to ask you a little bit about the international context and the proliferation risks, because I think this is something that you have worked on a long time, actually, already back in the 1980s, if I'm correct. One of the points that you made is that, you know, if we start going down the road of acquiring nuclear capacity, that's going to create incentives for further nuclear proliferation. So, but at the same time, you know, in a context of uncertainty, It's hard for states not to, think about that option if they feel that they are subject to nuclear threats. So can I ask you, a little bit about this?
Can I just start with two things? I wanted to say something about the knee-jerk. The knee-jerk wasn't so much in general about not responding to Russia, but it was that when we see a threat, our immediate reaction is to increase defense spending on the model of the past, without discussing that was what we meant by the knee-jerk. Not what we need is a public debate about the kind of defense we have, and whether that, a strengthened conventional defense, would be more expensive or less expensive is a matter of discussion. The second point is about resilience. I think in the case of hybrid and cyber threats, we don't really want to use the word deterrence. I suppose we could use deterrence by denial. But actually, I think the idea that you somehow might deter others by engaging in hybrid threats yourself or cyber attacks is really wrong. I think we have to be defensive. And that's why really we thought resilience was a better term than deterrence. I mean, you can argue that if we have an effective conventional defense or an effective cyber defense, maybe that will change the calculations of an enemy. But what's important is that we should be able to withstand whatever effect it has on others. So I agree very much with the Finnish point that resilience includes conventional defense. So that was on. And proliferation is, in a way, I think, at the heart of the argument. The Macron argument is basically, we need nuclear weapons because there are other powerful countries that have nuclear weapons. Well, why? What's wrong with Iran, and in that case, saying we want to have nuclear weapons? Why, why shouldn't any country that faces some power? Maybe Greenland should get nuclear weapons in order to be defended against America. I mean, that is the problem with the Macron argument. And and it's not the only problem, but it's the big problem. And actually, if you look at the world, what is so interesting is how many parts of the world actually have created nuclear-free zones. Mm-hmm. Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa. Why can't we do the same in Europe? Or at least try to do the same?
Because the answer to that, Mary, is because Mr. Putin is not minded to create a nuclear-free Europe. That's very simple. Just as a two-finger, Mr. Putin has sort of been, in the past 20 years, in the business of developing all sorts of newfangled nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, China is engaged in a massive, massive buildup of its strategic nuclear arsenal. The last person who made a sort of serious effort to further bring down the number of nuclear weapons in the world was a guy called Obama. He didn't get a lot of hearing from President Putin, as far as I remember. So I think that the effort NATO is committed to the NPT. And what should stop Iran from going nuclear is the NPT. So we are very much in the business of upholding the NPT. We have a review conference that is coming up in April. We believe that Article 6 of the NPT, which is reducing and eliminating nuclear weapons, is a very good goal. But I think we have to be realistic about the world in which we live, which is not exactly favorable to that regard.
Yeah, but the fact that Putin and China get more and more elaborate ways of killing millions of people doesn't mean that the answer is that we develop more and more ways of killing millions of people. Quite the opposite. I mean, I think for the European Union particularly, and maybe the idea of being a rights-based, law-based institution is incredibly important, and there is no way any use of nuclear weapons is a total violation of international law.
Right. Okay, yes, please, Annukka.
I think it's about what threats are we discussing. These times we need to discuss about the military threats, but at the same time there are different kind of threats arising from other than human actions, from nature, for example, or technological development, and these threats we cannot deter. We have to cope with them, we have to be resilient. So there has to be a balance in this our approach, and I really have to comment on this preparedness brochure made by our Western neighbor, because we have to understand that every country is in a bit different situation. For example, in Finland we also updated our brochure, but we had a different kind of perspective. Swedes, they had 2 people with rifles, and we chose to have 2 women, and the other one had an umbrella and the other one not. And if it rains, the one that has an umbrella copes better. It's about a different kind of mindset. In Finland, we understand the challenging situation. It is something that we have been prepared for, so we don't need to scare the people. We also, at the same time, we need to bring them a trust in the future.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I'd like to open this up for discussion. We have mics, and I have a question all the way down there, and then another question here. I'm going to ask you exactly to wait for the mic because of our online audience, but also if you could introduce yourselves so that we know who you are. Thank you.
Does work? Yes. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this nice, interesting event, really. Well, I introduce myself. I am a retired general. I work in NATO, in policy, and also I was a Siberian regiment commander, so I feel quite expert about nuclear. My point here is, and I ask for your opinion, or maybe Mr. Boris can answer me, I do not believe in nuclear deterrence anymore. Why say that? Right now, actually, I work for an aerospace company, so I'm doing other things, but sometimes I write articles for an online newspaper in Europe. And I wrote an article some time ago, maybe 1 month ago, and I would like just to quote for you, is a small portion of my article. Yeah, sure, of course. I do it. I just translate it in the metro for you because it was in Italian, my article. That Russia demonstrates every day her or its posture, brandishing nuclear weapons as a tool of pressure, an implicit message that sounds like global blackmail. Let me do it, they show in Moscow. I will raise the stake. The consequence is clear. Nuclear power to no longer function as a deterrent. I do not continue anymore. What do you think about? Because I had a lot of opinions and some also analysts that say we are good with this article. Thank you.
Very much. Can you pass on the microphone? I'm going to collect a few questions, otherwise we're not going to get round. So actually there's someone, there's someone just there, one here, and you. Yeah, I'll come to you, don't worry. And make it short.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is actually very, very short. It's for Professor Kaldor. 2 quick questions. First one, do you believe that Russia would invade Ukraine if it had nuclear weapons? Second one, would you be comfortable in a world where only China, Russia, and North Korea have nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Yourself?
Anthony Gaveau, I work for the European Commission, DG Enest.
Gentleman here, and then there was another hand. Yes. Oh, and okay, great. Please, just take notes so that we can do a good, nice round.
Good evening, my name is Joel. I'm taking a master's in security studies at the Brussels School of Governance. My question, you mentioned about breaking the taboo on talking about nuclear discussions because it's a bit of a empty space in that expertise. What would you recommend is the best course of action to breaking that taboo, both with policymakers but also with civil society? Thank you.
Thank you. Can you just pass the mic back there? And are you okay with collecting these questions and then you can pick and choose, yeah?
for Professor Kaldor as well. My name is Ryan. I'm a graduate student in Brussels as well. So the promise of nuclear deterrence is that it would prevent large-scale conflict. And so my question is, in the absence of nuclear weapons, do you believe that, or why do you believe that conventional defense can fulfill this same promise?
Thank you. And then, Patrick, I'll turn to you, and then I still need to decipher this.
Hi, Patrick Costello, retired EU official. 2 quick questions. One, I'm wondering if there is an option of something which is, I suppose, not wanting the best to be enemy of the good, given the unlikelihood of nuclear disarmament of Europe at this stage, whether the possibility of the French extending its nuclear umbrella to a European level would reduce what seems to me to be a growing risk of proliferation in Europe in the same ways that we're looking as though we might see in Northeast Asia. Secondly, on the question of cart before the horse and money and expenditure, given the US security strategy, is it not the case that buying American kit has security risks for Europeans at the moment, given the level of control of the servicing of that equipment? I'm thinking, for example, of the UK nuclear deterrent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have some questions from online audience, but I think, given the time, I'm going to pass the floor to Mary first. We'll go in the same order as before, and then if we have time, I'll read out some questions from our audience. And I apologize if I'm not able to go through them all. Mary.
Well,
you can choose, so otherwise we're never going to get to
yeah, so, I mean, of course, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for a security guarantee from all of us, including Russia, which didn't work. But on the other hand, I've often used that argument as an argument, but on the other hand, what people say is that those nuclear weapons weren't really independent, probably no more than the British ones are. So my feeling is that, and here I slightly differ from Boris, that I think what Russia really wants is to prevent alternative models of democracy that could represent a challenge to Russian society. And that means they will have won if they create chaos in Ukraine, and they would have they can do that kind of chaos, whether people have nuclear weapons or not. That's the importance of hybrid threats. It'd be horrible if Russia and China and North Korea were the only nuclear powers, but we have to, of course it would be horrible, but so it's horrible if there's a US as well. I mean, look at the contemporary US. I mean, it becomes very dangerous, whoever has nuclear weapons, because we can't rely on nuclear. The argument about deterrence is based on the idea that somehow governments are sane. You have to assume rationality, but what if they're not sane? And that can apply to anyone. And so it's incredibly dangerous. And then I think the question about Britain and France is a really difficult one. What I'm concerned, I think Britain definitely should get rid of its nuclear weapons because it's dependent on the US and it's incredibly expensive. So I don't have a problem with unilateral nuclear disarmament for Britain. What I'm trying to argue against is the idea of a new European nuclear deterrent, whether that means a French deterrent on behalf of Europe or whether that means something quite new. And I quite agree with you, if it means something quite new, that's what I'm really against. What I'd like to see is these, not unilateral, but actually making a contribution to NPT and non-proliferation and thinking about ways in which nuclear disarmament could actually contribute to a renewed round of arms control, which would make the world safer. I mean, for many years I've been suggesting, why doesn't Britain give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for Iran giving up uranium processing, or thinking quite out of the box about how one does this kind of thing. Okay.
Thank you. Annukka.
I'd like to just comment on about the reliance on US technology or so on. I think it's about the security of supply also. So you have to have your own production, but not only the production, but also the technological ability to do that. But I wouldn't concentrate on reliance, because there is also other way to approach it. Is it that whether you are interoperable? And I think that you should focus on that, not to rely, but be interoperable.
Among Europeans?
Yes, both ways. And that I think that in Europe there is a lot to do.
Boris, you have the final word.
To our Italian colleague, so yes, I believe that nuclear deterrence is still relevant, and that is why NATO's policy is to remain a nuclear alliance as long as there's nuclear weapons out there. I served as a conscript in the German Air Force in 1982. That was right after the big debates, the big demonstrations in Germany against the double zero, where NATO nations deployed cruise missiles and Pershings. And at the end of the day, we were able to eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons through the INF Treaty. But so as a conscript, that was hotly debated. So what about conventional defense? What about nuclear deterrence? And in a sense, we're having the same debates today, and those are important debates. One thing that is obvious is if you don't have significant and serious conventional defense, then nuclear deterrence is more of a question mark, right? So you need both things, in my mind. I think there's a question here about talking about nuclear deterrence. I think that's very important. Again, I'll say this as a German. In the 16 years of Angela Merkel's chancellorship, I don't think she gave a single speech devoted to nuclear deterrence. And she may never have referenced nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, in any way but the most general, imaginable way possible. And I think that's a mistake, because I think people have questions about nuclear weapons. They're legitimate questions. These are not comfortable weapons. We can take President Trump's word for that, right? President Trump has talked about this again and again, his dislike of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear. There's an echo of Ronald Reagan there, who was also a skeptic of nuclear weapons and came to sort of, look for ways of moving to arms control, and was successful. He was lucky. He had Gorbachev as his counterpart, and that made things possible. So I think there's a need for leaders to talk about deterrence and defense, including the nuclear component, and to face the music, to face the difficult questions. And on the French and British, so as opposed to Mary, not surprisingly, I'm quite happy that those weapons exist because they are part of the deterrence makeup of NATO. In the strategic concept, we say the independent strategic nuclear forces of the UK and France have a deterrent role of their own and contribute significantly to the overall security of the alliance. These allies' separate centers of decision-making contribute to deterrence by complicating the calculations of potential adversaries. And I think that's very true.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have really managed to address a difficult discussion with differing opinions in a very informative way. So I'd like to thank you all for doing that. I think this was really, really interesting. And I hope that we'll be able to, this is just the beginning of at least us trying to host discussions on these difficult matters, which I really think are important to European citizens. And let me just take advantage of this moment to just plug that we have started a series called Europe Head to Head, which is online debates, which then is turned into a podcast, which is really trying to understand what the real challenges are for Europeans and try to present them in ways that are very accessible to broader audiences. So thank you very much for joining us in this effort. Please, before I forget, there are drinks afterwards, and please join me in thanking the speakers.